Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is our first episode of The Pink Room with Pragmatic Consultancy. Phil's going to make me laugh all the way through this, so we'll just leave it like that. So first of all, thank you very much for joining. So I'm going to quickly introduce you to Phil. Phil is, of course, my lovely husband. He is also a director of Pragmatic Consultancy, which we set up 5 years ago, just over 5 years ago. Phil has over 30 years of experience in utilities, and we're going to dive right in about finding out how this came about. So over to you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're having an awesome day. I guess when I kind of look back, I mean, it's a very long time ago, and I feel really old. Probably not as old as I actually am. But I was, about 20, 21, back in 94, I guess. I started at London Electricity. I had no experience, no knowledge, no degree, no A-levels, really, nothing. And I started off working in a department that focused on prepayment customers that had queries on how to use their prepayment meter. And I did that. I answered phone calls from individuals, people. Obviously, this is way before Ofgem even existed. So we were an independent organisation focusing purely on supplying energy to London. Weirdly, we were also based in Newcastle. So me as a southerner sitting in the northeast of England, I quite enjoyed actually talking to the Londoners because I could understand what they were saying. So I sat there for about 6 months to a year as I constantly answered questions around prepayment, learned more about how prepayment worked. And as time went on, you see opportunities, you see how the workplace is working. The time before I started off in customer services and in a big office, I was predominantly working in retail. So I kind of understood how to interact with people. But opportunities arose, and I ended up running the prepayment back office department, where we would deal with removal of meters and implementation of prepayment meters, predominantly from when people weren't paying their bills. So we worked with revenue protection services, RON officers to put those meters in. It allowed me to then learn about the processes, not just on prepayment, but the whole processes about meters and meter management, the revenue protection services, the financials associated to consumer and consumer debt. And obviously this is all pre-deregulation. So we only really focused on law and consumer law. There was no Ofgem sitting there saying, you must do this, you must do that. And that's pretty much where I started my career of working in an office that had 2,500 people in it, from generic customer services to collections to meter management to prepayment, which is what I did. So it was large scale. I think we had around about 6.5 million customers in total, and around 270,000 prepayment customers. All of those customers I was responsible for the management of the data for all of those customers. I think you're on mute. I can't hear you.
So what made you leave London Electricity?
Well, I didn't leave right after that. There was a whole load of stuff. This is still back in 1994, 95. So when 95 started, that was the point of the initial start of deregulation. And that was all around commercial and business customers. And I had no involvement in that whatsoever. I just focused on what I was doing in my job and dealing with customers, supporting my staff, making sure they knew what they were doing. As we got close to 1998, where the domestic deregulation happened, I got pulled into working with the consultants on the migration into the now DTN, so the data transfer network, working with the data flows, understanding and learning how those data flows work, looking at how that switching process and prepayment processes would work. London Electricity also decided at that point in time it would be a really good idea to do a complete system change. So alongside learning all of the nuances of the data transfer network, the DTC, the regulation associated to it, all of the Marasco processes, we also had to then learn a whole new solution and system. So that got implemented and the rollout and training happened. And what seemed to happen, not just at London Electricity, but across the whole of the industry, prepayment was not really given a great deal of thought. And there was a huge amount of issues associated to the whole prepayment processes, predominantly around PP-MIPS, the allocation of monies associated to the meter. So I got pulled from my position as the team lead for back office function and moved into special projects, where I was asked to find a shortfall of around about £9 million that they've identified post-migration and post-deregulation. This had then allowed me to look more about how systems manage and allocate the financials associated to customer accounts, predominantly around prepayment, but more broadly around how systems can fail based on the manipulation of data an end user can put in. So through that process, I then, working with one other person, so there's only two of us, we managed to find about 99% of all of the money that was missing. And then just as a takeaway, just before we kind of told our boss that we had found circa 8 million quid, we asked her, if we find anything, is it all right if we get 10% bonus linked to how much we find? So if you find, 100 quid, we'll get £10. At which point she agreed. And so we then waited a week while kind of just tidying bits and pieces up, and then presented her with the figures and said, there we go, we've saved you just shy of 9 million quid. Obviously, it wasn't real £9 million. It was all documentation, monetary and things like that. Yeah. But the budget allocation was there. At which point she went, oh, that's brilliant, thanks guys. And we both turned around and said, right, brilliant. Where's our 900 grand each? Thank you very much. And she just turned around and said, no, I can't give you that. But the London Electricity at the time were offering a reward scheme, and they had a little booklet that had everything that you could award a member of staff, from helicopter flights to rally driving, days out, all of the red letter days, as well as kind of get money off coupons. And she just said, have everything in the book. I suppose it worked out at kind of, maybe 15 grand, but it wasn't real money out of her pocket. So, from that, I had some really great experiences of, flying helicopters, going onto a rally course, doing the whole skid pan things in cars. As a 22-year-old at that point in time, going for a spa day was a little bit strange, should we say? Especially as the guy who worked with me was an ex-Marine and, in terms, a proper manly man. And so we're just sitting in this strange spa wearing our pants.
Okay. Well, I think
so when that kind of finished, my boss left, and then I was left kind of in limbo of, do I go back to what I was doing or do I look for something else? So I thought, well, I need to kind of progress my career. I'm kind of in a bit of limbo. So I managed to get a job at Sage Accounting, which had nothing to do with energy whatsoever. So I actually did leave the energy industry in around about 1999. Yeah, 1999. And it was quite an interesting time that a lot of my work colleagues were also looking at new jobs, that the change that had happened from not being regulated to then being regulated, and the oversight and the processes we need to follow. We were no longer around to kind of just do what we thought was right. We had to follow a set process. So a lot of people at that point left the industry. So I started working at Sage Accounting, and went through that process of learning accountancy practices, procedures, processes. And I always find it's really strange of the training that they gave us was somewhere between an A-level and a degree on accountancy. And I went through that process over a 3-month period where they cut people out where they weren't performing, and I got through. And then I was offering the accountancy support, but the whole time in my head going, I didn't do well in my GCSEs in maths. I had to sit them 3 times to get the grade. But I think the key thing is I understood how to apply my knowledge rather than having to sit a test. And I worked through that process and carried on working at Sage. It wasn't very long. It was only for about a year. And then, some stuff happened in my personal life, and I ended up having to move back down to Surrey. And then that opened a completely different chapter of where I really started my consultancy career.
Okay, so you moved out of finance.
Yeah, I moved from Newcastle, where I was working for Sage. I mean, like I said, I was only there a year. And then moved back down to Surrey, where I grew up, and I got a job working for at the time it was called Total Fina-Elf, which is now Total Gas and Power. At that time, they only provided gas, but they wanted to move into the electricity industry, and obviously because it had now moved into deregulated space, they wanted somebody to assist them in understanding the processes and procedures they need to do for electricity in order to get the license. So I applied for the role, I got it, and I worked with the business change and transformation team, predominantly as a business analyst on their processes associated to the Marasco golden threads. And for anyone listening who is as old as me, that was the Bible. So we applied that to the business and our systems that we took in, and went through that whole project of making sure that we were compliant, and obviously going through the license application and providing all that information to Ofgem. And that took around 2 years, going through that process of systems. And I remember sitting in some strange offices looking and working with systems, doing some reviews of processes, and eventually that went live in 2001. But I'd got the bug of project work and analysis, and I didn't want to go back to generic operational roles, at which point they couldn't offer me that role and just offered me a billing manager job for electricity. So I moved at that point, and took a job at a company called ABB. And again, the older people who might be listening might remember that ABB, for the product they've released, which was Merchant Plus and Enroll Plus. That was kind of the predecessor to kind of the Junipers and the Krakens and the SG in the world. And it was only really ABB with Merchant Plus and MMT who had solutions in a deregulated marketplace. So I went on a pathway with those guys of learning their systems, and they sent me on a lot of training courses, and I mean a lot of training courses around business analysis, looking at consultancy practices. And at that time, there was a distinct separation between a person who is a consultant and a person who is a business analyst. And there was two completely different skill sets. There was a bit of merging between the two in terms of knowing your subject matter, but that skill set was completely separated. So I worked with those guys for about 4 years, I guess, and brought in new customers and new clients into the industry, and then started running the team of the consultants within that organization. And our job was predominantly to bring people into the market, and along with providing consultancy and systems to the rest of the market that was already there. And obviously through those 4 years, we saw quite a lot of consolidation between the historic 14 suppliers, moving and shrinking that down, where the people like EDF bought London Electricity and Seaboard, and SWEB, Southwest Electricity Board. And so we worked with all of those. And I think at that point, back in, that'd be 2005, I'd worked with pretty much every single supplier in the UK, with the exception of Scottish Power. And there was so much change happening, and so much change happening really quickly, and so many people coming into the industry. It was really, really good. And the key thing I want to say is a lot of people came into the industry through the process of application to Ofgem. There was no off-the-shelf offering. There was no, you can buy a licensed company. They had to go through a process. So I got to know all of the Elexon and Marasco auditors, where I was working with clients and going through that process of audit and compliance. And I learned a lot through that process of how do you manage change while you're being audited through that process. And you've also got to remember, this is in days before Teams. This is days where you had to be in the office, you were face to face, and you had to prove to the auditor, not just on paperwork, but also through conversations and interviews, and loosely being grilled or interrogated, that you knew what you were doing and that the company knew what it was going to be able to achieve. So unfortunately, ABB changed hands to a company called Arriva, and then changed hands to a company called Alstom. But at that point, I was given a huge opportunity to then expand out of the UK and start working in Europe, and looking at how Alstom solutions can be used throughout Europe. So I started getting involved in SCADA solutions around network and network monitoring. I was looking at multi-currency solutions for billing and payment. And I spent about 2 years working throughout Europe, around, through Germany, Holland, France, Denmark, Italy, Spain, which as a single guy in his mid-20s was awesome. And, mid to late 20s, I was being paid a decent amount of money, but had no expenditure, and got to experience life in all of the European countries. But as I said, unfortunately, they went bust. So they didn't go bust. They decided to sell that part of their business. So I was made redundant, and then had to decide what I was going to do.
Yeah, so this leads you on to coming back to the digital side of your experience?
Yeah, kind of. So when I kind of looked at what I needed to do, an old client, a guy called Ken Marchant, called me and said, can you come and help us out with the solution? There are so many issues and problems in our data. And he worked for a company called Biz Energy, who have gone bust a fair while around. So I went to go and contract with him for about 6 months, and through that process of all of a sudden I was alone with no support mechanism behind me, whereas normally I'd have developers, IT staff, support teams all sitting behind me as I'm looking at things and making those decisions. And this time it was just me as a consultant offering advice, looking at systems, looking at data, looking at how I can fix data through really at the time basic SQL querying and updates. And then I went through that with them and helped them tidy their data prior to them doing a system change and moving away from the old ABB Merchant Plus system. And I get a phone call from a recruiter who then asked me to pretty much do exactly the same for Ecotricity. So I moved because I wasn't really needed at Biz Energy anymore. So I moved over to Ecotricity. But because they needed more of a permanent solution, they offered me a role of IT manager. So IT wasn't my real background. I'd never really understood or done anything in IT other than looking at databases and data queries. But I saw an opportunity again to learn and expand my knowledge in an industry that was still changing. So I accepted and took the job. Obviously I needed to do a huge amount, and I mean huge amount of catch up and learning. And I remember buying a book called Learn SQL in 10 Minutes, as they were asking me some really complicated questions of, can you do this? Can you do that? And I managed to kind of build my knowledge on data, IT infrastructure. I had 2 really good people working for me who helped me learn and understand how IT works and how IT needs to support a company, rather than what I used to see, which was IT was very much, you do what we say. But they had a very different view of, we're here to serve a company for that company to succeed. And that fundamentally drove into me of, when you're looking at kind of consultancy and IT and ancillary services that aren't really directly delivering to a consumer, they are there to serve the company, for the company to be able to be successful. And I learned that. And obviously I was managing these people who were teaching me. So it was quite an interesting time. And I sat there for 4 years, progressing my knowledge, understanding more about it. Part of my role, which is really strange as an IT manager, was I was also responsible for pricing and forecasting, working with the trading department on energy. So again, through that really wasn't my background. But again, I worked with the pricing analysts, I worked with the trading guys, and learned the complexities around pricing and quoting. At that time, Ecotricity was predominantly domestic, but I was really focusing more on bespoke pricing associated to their commercial customers. So I learned the nuances associated to it. But I kind of got to a point and went, if I want to still progress, I don't think I can do it any further within Ecotricity. I am seen as the IT manager guy who understands pricing, quoting, but also kind of understands industry process. And I kind of sat there for 6 months to a year just going, well, yeah, that's me. But I knew I needed to kind of progress some more. And I really wanted to find a new opportunity that I could build myself into. So I'd had a few different organizations come in, like Deloitte and KPMG and Capgemini and Logica, and so I thought, well, maybe I'd move to one of these large consultancy system implementation organizations, because that will at least allow me to experience other things that are going on with an organization that is fully embedded within the industry. So I looked at them all, to be honest, and applied for Logica, which some people find strange as to why did I go for Logica and not go for Capgemini or Deloitte or KPMG. But Logica seemed to be able to offer a much better work-life balance and allow me to still develop rather than just chasing the next role, next job, the next thing. So I moved to Logica, which was quite interesting. And I spent another 4 years at Logica, predominantly working on system change and business transformation programs. And I guess the key part of what I found when I was there was working with a highly respected individual in the world of business change and transformation. And he constantly wanted to implement best practice. And I always found that the strangest expression of best practice and I challenged him. I said, does best practice really exist? Because from my experience, and at this point, I'm looking at roughly 10, 11, 12 years of experience of different organizations across the whole of the UK. And what I saw was best practice really didn't exist. It was either new processes or it was normal processes. And a lot of people focused on best practices, new processes, and it isn't. So you implement something new, an organization takes a risk and does something new. It either works or it doesn't work. If it works, it has a brief moment of being the best, but then everyone else adopts it and it just becomes normal. So I challenged him and going, that doesn't really exist. You either do the new or you do the normal. This guy, he was an academic, and he turned to me and he said, in all of my life of doing this, which is 25 years, no one has challenged me and been correct. And then walked away. At which point, massive ego buzz, given this is a guy that failed his GCSEs, talking to an academic and winning. Anyway, that's a little story. So I continued working with Logica. I progressed my career with those guys and, moved around to other organizations. And I was working very closely with a service provider, obviously with system implementation and service delivery at Logica. We work with third parties, and we work with a third party who is very much embedded into the market messaging solutions within the UK. And I'd worked with them at EcoTrustee and other organizations as we kind of implemented it. And every time I worked with them, I really enjoyed the way that they worked. And so I turned around to their MD and basically said, not being funny, I want to come and work with you. At which point he turned around and said, why would I recruit you? Because I want you to carry on doing what you're doing, because you are our cheapest and best sales channel. Because everywhere I went, their solution was what I would implement. And that worked immensely well for them. But I did eventually move, and I did get in there. And it was a very interesting time. But I will leave that there, and we'll move on to the chapter of more of the changes in the industry of how things happened, and the shift from individual application and then my support to mass market delivery of entry into the industry.
So are you indicating that this is the time where data is starting to really take hold?
I think no one really thought about it as data takes hold. Everyone was very much focused on process and focusing on accuracy to process and reporting on KPIs of against that process. No one really thought about data at all. They just saw it as a process of I've got to send this from A to B, and didn't really think about the nuances of what is that information I'm sending, what is the impact of that data. And obviously a lot of that changed under the rules of when GDPR started to come in, and much more of a move from in-house legacy install solutions to kind of the world of multiple access into remote solutions. I mean, this is pre-cloud. Azure didn't exist at this point in time, so everything was kind of in-house, embedded, with no real outside access to that information, with the exception of sending raw flat file data over a kind of dedicated line. So the whole world of internet and IP access to solutions and data, it wasn't there, and everything was very insular in-house. But there was a lot more move to looking at data warehouses and data extraction to report on information. But again, at that time, no one really thought about data insights and data analytics, looking at data trends, and that just didn't exist. No one really cared or thought about it. So again, it was, when I left Logica, it was still kind of just doing the same thing of, consulting with companies, telling them what the processes were, helping them understand the data that needed to be sent from A to B, and just building that capability of educating people of what they needed to do, pretty much right down to a really low level. Even kind of, when you look at a meter on a wall, this is how this meter is configured. This is where this wire goes. This is how it works. Data wasn't king at that point. Understanding knowledge and physical assets was.
So looking back on your career in energy, and to kind of wrap it up, what would you say to your younger self, or someone wanting to come in to the industry?
I think from some of the conversations I have now with people who have only really been in the industry kind of around 8 to 10 years, is look back in time, back to kind of 2000 and 2001, and look at what we had to do then in order to come into the market, of how we needed to support, how we needed to ensure compliance and robustness of those organizations, and engage with the regulator and engage with the industry as a whole, along with learning the nuances of every single process. And don't just think about, okay, this is ABC. In 2016, you could just buy a license off the shelf. This isn't fair. What we did in the early days in the energy industry was everything was manual, everything was painful, everything was scrutinized to the nth degree, and every penny was checked. But the market grew, and you learn having to go through that process. So you come out the other side of that going, I went into this job to write a process map. I've come out of this job knowing everything there is on an end-to-end journey through this organization, from a system perspective, but also from a consumer perspective, and also from an end user perspective in every single role that they're going to have to operate in. And that's what I suggest people start doing. If I was to come into the market now, I would want someone like me to tell them, go away and learn everything. Look at how these processes interlink. And there was a guy that used to work for me when I was at Logica, and I'm going to name drop now, a guy called Steve Jones. And I asked him, and he was a graduate at that point, he had no real experience. And I asked him, here's a list of all of these processes. These are the inputs into it. Here's the outputs on it. There's a wall. Go away, stick them on the wall and make them all map up. And I gave him a week. After about 3 days, he came back to me and said, this is impossible, Phil. Please, can I do this in 3 dimensions? Because I cannot get a single input and output. And at that point, he was lodging with another graduate. And that graduate came over and said, he has spent every single moment from you giving him that, even in the evenings, trying to get everything to line up. And annoyingly, I turned around to him and said, well done, Steve. That's the right answer. At which point he looked confused. And a lot of people see processes as a linear transaction. If you do one, it moves to another. What he learned was the multiple layers of processes and the relationships between different processes in different areas and how they all work together. And that I would advise people to sit down and try and do, of try and take your business and map it in two dimensions. And then you will learn exactly where all of the areas within your organization are interlinked, because you can't map an energy industry in a 2-dimensional landscape. And that's my bit of advice.
Yeah, so I think we're running out of time, but it's been fantastic to have you on our first ever podcast in the Pink Room. It sounds like we've got some follow-up queries and questions that we're touch base on. But for now, thank you very much, Phil.
No problem. Bye for now.